main and primary question I get when reviewing dApps such as this is why would you bother buying one if you've already bought an expensive phone which may even still have a headphone jack and may have good quality audio output and a fair bit of storage? Well, the reason will be, such as myself, when I travel, I don't want to drain my phone's battery listening to music and then arrive at my destination after, say, a long flight and find the phone is flat. Or I may wish to do some kind of setup which I can't readily charge it at the same time, or it gets too hot, or there's some other issue, but basically I don't want to use my phone, so I'll often use a player such as this. And they can be used in about 3 different ways. You can use it either with a pair of headphones through one of the jacks here, or you can use it using the USB output to another device. So if you have another high quality audio device you want to use it with, it makes the M3 Ultra a digital transport in that regard. Or you may have a pair of Bluetooth headphones of some kind. I have a pair of Sony's, which I use for traveling, and you may want to use it as a transport for that. Whereas a more expensive player, which has, say, better quality audio, well, that's kind of redundant because the actual digital to analog conversion will happen in the headphones and not in the player. You only get digital to analog conversion when the output is, well, analog, in the case of like the headphone jacks. But one of the advantages of the M3 Ultra is it's below $500. It's $20 cheaper than the similarly priced $499 M11S from FiiO, and it's smaller, which is one great advantage. You can see it's considerably shorter than the M11S I recently reviewed. It's a little bit narrower. It's a little bit rounder as well on the edges, and it's about the same thickness. And of course, they're thicker than phones because they contain not just a, phone circuitry, in this case, a Snapdragon 660 setup, which is, as things go, quite old, but they also contain amplification circuits and a fairly large battery. So that means you get plenty of battery life and you get the ability to play back music, usually through at least in-ear monitors, if not full-sized headphones, to some degree, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, the other thing you get, of course, is a micro SD card slot. And that means, of course, you can get cards up to 1 terabyte that will go on the slot. So you can store a fair bit of music depending on the kind of music you decide to store, whether it be, if it's MP3s, obviously a large amount, or if it's FLAC, quite a fair amount. And if it's anything large like DSD, say if you want to use, some people use these as like a transport for DSD music, which is extremely large, then maybe not quite as much. But that micro SD card I want to talk about a little bit. If you are buying a player such as this and you do decide to buy a micro SD card, especially a 1 terabyte one, don't buy any generic ones which have random brand names that change every month, because they are most often fake, especially if they're only like $20 or $29, definitely fake. And I've seen people very disappointed in buying them and thinking they're getting a real card and not. So buy a good quality SanDisk, PNY, Lexar, Samsung, or I'll link to some in the description, which will also help support my channel if you buy through those links. But make sure you don't buy a fake one, of which there are always some around. One thing about that micro SD card slot, incidentally, is it uses a little plastic flap. Now on the M11S, it just pops in and out. There's a kind of no seal there, but the case does cover over it to protect it from dust and moisture getting in. Whereas with the Shanling M3 Ultra, you have a case which has a hole on the bottom, so it doesn't cover the micro SD card slot. You can just still access it with the case on, which is a nice advantage, and I guess that's why they have this protective cover. However, I'm a little bit worried about, you can see the little white line in there where it gets a bit strained, and I'm not sure how many times you can bend this before it's going to fail. And it does make getting the card a little bit fiddly to get in and out. You do have to have a long fingernail or some dexterity. But anyway, that's just a minor thing, but it is, a nice unit. It's aluminium. It has this, I guess, plastic bottom. It has a kind of plastic back with a screen protector on, and the screen protector cover I still have on here. And it has a screen protector on the front. And so as things go, yeah, it does the job. And now it only has a Snapdragon 660 processor in it, which is, as processors go for what's based on an Android phone kind of setup, is pretty old. And so, but that being said, it's not designed for gaming or any such thing like that. It's designed primarily to play back music and maybe just watch a little bit of YouTube or something like that. That's all it's really designed to do. But it does have full Android on here. So you do have the Google Play Store. You can sideload apps. You can do everything essentially you can with normal Android, except that there's, of course, no camera and there's no cellular. But otherwise, you can run it essentially as you would an Android phone. And in this case, you can see I've already, side loaded some Qobuz on here, since Qobuz is not available in the Play Store in Japan where I am. But before we get into the playing back music, one critical thing we need to talk about is the output. Now you'll see there are two headphone jacks on here, and on the right is your regular 3.5mm jack. On the left is what's called a balanced 4.4mm Pentacon. Actually, in fact, this plug. Now, there's a bit of a long story. If you're not familiar with balanced audio in the portable realm, this will be a bit new. But essentially, balanced audio was hyped up especially in portable audio to a large degree, especially in Asia, to the point that people think that if you say high-end device, an audiophile player does not have balance, then it's no good and people won't buy it. And it's meant that even cheap gear has been focused on balanced circuitry, which is circuitry that basically doubles the amount of amplification, and the actual benefits in something around this price is effectively nothing. It just means it adds some complication to, if you want to use, say, headphones or in-ear monitors, because the circuit will be prioritized around the quality of the balanced output, and the 3.5mm output will generally be compromised. And unless you're buying a high-end player which has a really good 3.5mm output as well, it means you're going to only get the best results, at least with wired headphones, if you use the 4.4mm output, or I should say wired headphones or wired in-ear monitors. But if you're using full-sized headphones, like, as I said, Bluetooth headphones, then if you're just using wireless and you're not using any of these jacks, then it won't matter. Or if you're just using it as a transport with a USB out, then the fact whatever amplification it has will have no relevance whatsoever. Now, the player itself, well, you can use any Android music player that you like, that you particularly prefer. Some people like using, say, UAPP, or they may want to use your favorite app from whatever company. You might have Apple Music or Qobuz or Tidal. And anything you can download onto this, you can essentially use. But if you just want to use the default player, it has some good and bad points, especially compared to, say, its competitors such as the FiiO app and the hobbies app. Now, in terms of features, one thing it's missing is gapless playback. That's the one thing that's really, really great omission from this player. It's quite surprising, in fact, that there's no gapless. But everything else, it is kind of much like any kind of player. You update the library, and then you can access songs where you can list all the songs, you can list folders, albums, and everything like that, and they'll come up with album art pretty quickly. And I have a fairly fast card in here, so it's pretty snappy as things go, and it does have a nice cache of music, so you can access things as necessary. And it even has a little playlist function that you can create playlists, either recents, favorites, or you can create playlists as necessary. Though I did see someone complain that when they did load playlists on here, it would sort them alphabetically by default, which is really annoying. So the other thing you can do if you have, say, like you're an Apple user such as myself, and transferring to Android over USB is a pain, is it does have a Wi-Fi transfer option, so you can do that via a web page and drag songs in there, drag music in there. You can access network attached storage on your network, so you can stream to it if you're just using it, say, at home. And it does have a cool feature if you do have multiple Shanling devices, that it has a sync link which allows one device to play back or control music on another. So, but in the settings, there are a couple of useful things in here, which it's bizarre that it doesn't have gapless, but it does have some of these things, so it's kind of odd. One of the cool things is that you can actually choose whether it resumes playback or not, and I think most players have this, so that if you're listening to a long podcast, you don't want to have to find your place again, you can just resume from where you were playing before. It has the ability, when you tap on a song to play, it can either stay in the list view and then the song just pops up at the bottom like a lot of players, or it can actually transition to the playback screen, and you can select whether it does that or not, which is really handy. Whether it plays through folders, and whether it pauses when you pull out headphones, and you can have automatically gain adjust as necessary, although that may degrade the sound quality a bit. It has a basic 10-band EQ if you want to use that, like most players. And it can control a few features on the lock screen, whether you have what you have on there, whether it shows the album cover and that kind of thing. It has a UV meter display, which you probably saw, which is pretty cool, and the kind of theme. And some other settings in here, and my light's just reflecting, I can't see what I'm doing. USB output actually has fairly comprehensive settings if you're using it as a digital transport, where you can have exclusive access to the device and no other apps can access the device, and some settings for things like DSD, whether if your device has built-in volume control that can be controlled over USB, like a lot of dongle DACs. You can select whether that it will control the volume or not, which can be a little bit dangerous because some things will pop to maximum value sometimes. And or lock maximum volume, say if I'm using the Cayenne's R6, which you must have maximum volume at all times to prevent distortion. And things like USB DSD compensation, if you know what that is. If you don't worry. And the output, if you have to lock the bit depth for any reason, if you have a device such as, if I plug this into, say, a pair of Odyssey Mobius, where one of the particular settings, you have to have 2496 output for everything. So you have actually a lot of flexibility as a transport, but in terms of general playback, well, yeah, the gapless thing. But it also has LHDC wireless options, which is for some, and I think it's still fairly obscure, a high-quality competitor to Sony's LDAC for headphone Bluetooth audio, I should say. But in that, there are, apart from it just being stock Android 10 essentially, it does have a few extra settings so that you can have the outputs as fixed line out without the headphone amplification essentially bypassed. You have 2 gain levels, which are obviously also accessible via the usual pull down, which has a few extra settings in there. You can, the usual wireless Bluetooth and particular modes. Including a USB DAC mode, so you can use it as straight from a computer. And it also has, and jumps out of the settings for me, thank you very much. It also has in here, the usual balance, the boot volume, what volume it boots up at, especially to avoid, hearing damage when you've just gone from, say, sensitive in-ear monitors, like I have here, through to full-sized headphones, or back the other way, and you don't want to have the volume suddenly at maximum at high gain. And you can select the wireless playback quality, whether if you're not using LDHC, you can select which particular option for wireless playback quality you want. If LDAC, say sound quality, you have a pair of LDAC Bluetooth headphones, such as I have, and the sound quality first results in dropouts, you can change it as necessary, for example, or lock stuff down to a lower, more reliable connection if you're just using some, say listening to podcasts. So you also have a really cool thing. You can actually switch it into not only just USB DAC mode, where it just acts as a dumb, digital to analog converter. It also has a dedicated AirPlay mode, so you can use it as an AirPlay receiver. Say, for example, if you had someone who has a phone and they want to stream to your hi-fi system, you could use it as an AirPlay receiver. So that's actually a pretty cool feature. The one thing I wish it had is what FiiO has, and FiiO has a car mode, which it will power on automatically when it receives power through the USB, so as if it's plugged into a car and the engine's switched on, and then automatically powers off after a few seconds after the car's turned off. It loses power through the USB. And that's one thing it doesn't have, but unless you're installing a whole bunch of apps on here, essentially I found that I could leave it running, if it's just going to run it every day, you could leave it running overnight and the battery won't drain that much anyway. So you can always just set, the power off timer, or just not have it not power off at all. And I've even known people to do stuff like, sync music, to their car overnight and update their playlists using Wi-Fi, because if it's still powered on, it will still do that. Now, if you're using it as a transport, as a digital transport, well, the quality is going to be obviously pretty good. I didn't go and try and do super detailed listening tests between devices, as I found that using, USB out, it's going to be a good quality transport to something like devices I have here. I have some cord gear here, which often need to transport if I'm not using the 2Go, for example. Because it's not connected to the power and there's no noise coming through the ground plane, it will generally work pretty well. And of course, if there's not a lot of software running on here, the sound quality is going to be good. Likewise, Bluetooth headphones, it's mainly a non-issue. The only thing, of course, is the concern about dropouts, and I didn't do any major testing in that regard because it will require me actually going out into the city to do some testing like that. But I haven't seen anyone complain about, Bluetooth audio quality or dropouts in general in that regard. If I do see anything, I'll put some information in either a comment or in the description. But you'd think nowadays manufacturers do fairly significantly test these devices and how well they work with Bluetooth and how well the Bluetooth antenna is set up. And generally I've found that I can go across the house with Bluetooth devices and still get good quality audio. One area in which people are concerned about is the sound quality from the headphone outputs. Now, at the $500 mark, it's not going to be really super fantastic. As we found with the M11S, it was kind of like their really basic kind of under $100, USB players such as the E10K and that kind of thing. And it was much the same kind of situation with in-ear monitors and full-sized headphones. Now, I have a couple of really super high-end pairs, well, maybe not super high-end pairs of in-ear monitors. We have Campfire Audio's IEMs, which are very sensitive in-ear monitors and pick up hiss readily. And we also have the Final A8000s. Now, these are fairly, I'd probably say, a bit on the bright side as things go. And as in-ear monitors go, were not a fantastic match with something like the M11S, because the M11S, the audio quality is mostly focused on measurement quality. So it's, how much, how impressive does it look in measurements? And that meant that with some music, I was just listening to some Cake, for example, they sounded kind of pretty harsh and sibilants came through really clearly, and it was kind of unpleasant to listen to with, good in-ear monitors. But if you have a really dark pair of kind of cheaper in-ear monitors, well, it should be pretty fine. Now, with the Shanling M3 Ultra, however, the sound seemed to be a little bit warmer. There seemed to be more bloomy bass, and the treble wasn't quite so sharp and piercing, although I did still notice sibilants in the tracks where there were sibilants available, but it was much more listenable. And I've had friends who have had other Shanling DAPs, and they preferred them. That's the synergy with the in-ear monitors they had, that they were really happy listening even with the cheaper DAP and the in-ear monitors because the synergy was so good. And I think that's one advantage where the Shanling M3 Ultra is better than the M11S, is just the output. It's not going to, power full-size headphones particularly spectacularly. I tried the very sensitive Meze 109 Pros, and it did a really good job with those, but they are super sensitive and easy to power out of anything. But it was definitely more pleasant to listen with the Shanling M3 Ultra than it was the M11S in that regard. Powering any larger full-sized headphones or more demanding full-sized headphones like the M11S, it started to get more kind of shouty, and it was obviously struggling to power them well. And a step up in amplification was definitely going to help there. So it probably could be fine. I wouldn't tend to use this neither with the M11S, as for using with in-ear monitors or full-sized headphones, unless they were fairly warm and dark sounding and it would kind of, hide the flaws a little bit. But I would tend to use this as a digital transport, like I said before, with Bluetooth headphones, or maybe as a transport, from the USB out to something like one of the cord devices, which I have here. But at least it sounded pretty decent with in-ear monitors, and I did select some which are probably overkill compared to what you might use with something like this, to kind of test what its kind of absolute performance was. And in that, while it was fairly basic, it was actually fairly listenable, with a reasonable amount of detail and a little bit of warmth to the sound, kind of balance things out, as these tend to be both pairs are fairly bright in-ear monitors. So overall, I think Shanling did a really good job with the M3 Ultra. They've obviously targeted the M11S in many respects. It doesn't have a couple of the cool features the M11S has, such as a customizable button or the car mode, but those are kind of fairly minor things compared to the fact that it's considerably smaller. It's fairly comparable overall. They both have 32 gigabytes of memory and 3 gigabytes of RAM. And they both can take, one micro SD card slot, and they both have the same outputs more or less. Although if you're one of those people who have archaic 2.5mm, well, then the M11S has that. But again, this is not the kind of player that you'd mostly buy for its sound analog output. It's probably one that a lot of people might buy as a digital transport. So I think the next time I'm getting on a plane, it looks like the M3 Ultra might be the go for me, for something I will take as a device to work with my Sony headphones and avoid flattening my phone's battery. So I hope this quick review was helpful, and if you do own one of these, do consider posting a comment below, explain your experiences, and this will also help other people watching this video, as it will give them an idea of whether to buy or not to buy this player. And in that regard, I will put links below to where you can buy this player. If you use those links, that supports my channel as well. So as always, thanks once again to all my patrons and everyone who has supported me, and I look forward to seeing you online.